You are listening to Craziest HOA Moments. This is the pettiest parking war ever. I am here to keep order. That was the first thing Betty Wilson said to me when she stepped in front of my driver door, with a clipboard and a smile that looked like it had been practiced in a mirror. I had just pulled into my driveway after a 12-hour shift cleaning pool filters and checking chlorine levels across 3 different HOA properties, and now a flatbed tow truck was reversing toward my car with its amber lights strobing across the wet pavement. I tried to open my door, but Betty pressed the clipboard against the window. The tow was already authorized, she said. My appeal window was closed. I work as a pool service technician in Kirkland, Washington, which means I understand HOA politics better than most people. I know how boards operate, how they justify expenses, and how they use vendor contracts to control behavior. I had moved into Prairie Crossing 6 months earlier because the house was priced right and I needed to sell it fast to cover a down payment on a property closer to my aging parents. The HOA seemed normal at first, standard rules about lawn height and trash cans. Then the parking enforcement started. Guest passes that expired after 4 hours. Decals that had to be renewed every quarter. Fire lane markings that appeared overnight with no warning. Street parking bans that changed based on which board member was annoyed that week. Betty Wilson ran the fines and enforcement program like it was her personal revenue stream, and she bragged about her collections at every meeting. The tow driver climbed out of the cab and started hooking chains to my front axle. I knocked on my own window, and Betty stepped back just enough to let me crack the door open. I asked what violation I was being towed for. She tapped the clipboard. Unauthorized parking in a restricted zone. I looked at my driveway. I was parked in my own driveway. She shook her head. The violation was from 3 days ago when I parked on the street for 20 minutes while I unloaded equipment. I pulled out my phone and opened my photos. I had taken a picture of my truck in the driveway that morning because I was documenting everything after the first round of fines. Betty glanced at the phone and then turned to the tow driver. "This is not parking, it is a violation," she said. "Proceed with the tow." The tow driver hesitated. He looked at me, then at Betty, then at the address placard on my house. I told him this was my driveway and I had proof I was not parked illegally 3 days ago. Betty cut in. "The proof does not matter because the appeal window closed at 5 p.m. yesterday." I checked my watch. It was 4:30. She smiled again. "The notice was posted on your door 72 hours ago. Which means your window to contest expired yesterday." I asked to see the notice. She pulled a folded policy sheet from her pocket and shoved it in my face. The print was dense and the fold lines made it hard to read, but I caught the phrase about 72-hour appeal windows and the line about tow authorization once the window closed. I asked when the notice was posted. She said 3 days ago at 9 a.m. I asked for proof of posting. She said the HOA does not provide proof, only notices. The tow driver shifted his weight. He said he needed to see documentation or he was not taking the vehicle. Betty pulled out her phone and showed him a photo of a notice taped to my door. The timestamp on the photo said 72 hours ago. I leaned closer. The photo showed my front door, but the angle was wrong. The door in the picture had a brass kick plate I did not have. I pointed that out. Betty zoomed in on the photo until the kick plate was out of frame. "See," she said, "your door." The tow driver looked uncomfortable. He said he would need a signed authorization from the property management company. Betty handed him a printed form with a signature at the bottom. No name, just a looping scrawl. The driver folded the paper and told me he was required to proceed unless I could produce a valid guest pass or a current decal. I did not have a guest pass because I was not a guest. I lived here. My decal was on my windshield. He walked around to the front and looked. No decal. I looked. The decal was gone. I asked Betty where my decal went. She said decals fall off sometimes, and it is the resident's responsibility to replace them within 24 hours. I had not noticed it was missing. She said ignorance is not a defense. The tow policy is clear. No decal means no proof of residency, which means the vehicle is treated as an unauthorized guest vehicle, which means it is subject to immediate tow after the appeal window closes. I asked how I was supposed to appeal a violation I did not know about. She said the notice was posted. I said the notice was not on my door. She held up her phone again. The photo proves it was posted. I took a screenshot of her photo and zoomed in on the metadata. The timestamp was 3 days ago, but the location tag showed an address 4 blocks away. I showed her the screen. She glanced at it and said metadata can be wrong. I said that was convenient. The tow driver asked if we could settle this without a tow. Betty said no. The authorization was signed and the appeal window was closed. I asked who signed the authorization. She said the property management company regional supervisor. I asked for a name. She said that information is confidential. I pulled out my own phone and called the management company. The receptionist answered, and I explained the situation. She put me on hold. Betty turned to the tow driver and told him to finish the hookup. He looked at me. I held up one finger. The receptionist came back on the line and said there was no record of a tow authorization for my address. I put the call on speaker. Betty leaned in and said the authorization was processed this morning and the system might not be updated yet. The receptionist said all authorizations are logged immediately. Betty ended the call by reaching over and tapping my screen. I redialed. She stepped between me and the tow driver. "You will pay the fee, then you will pay the fee about the fee," she said. I kept my phone in my pocket because I was saving one clip for the finale. The tow driver unhooked the chains. He said he was not taking the vehicle without a confirmed authorization from the management company. Betty told him she would report him to his supervisor. He said go ahead. He climbed back into the cab and drove off. Betty turned to me and said this was not over. She would file an additional violation for obstructing an authorized tow and the fee would double. I asked how I obstructed anything. She said I interfered with the driver by making a phone call. I said I was allowed to verify the authorization. She said verification is not allowed once the appeal window closes. I asked to see that rule in writing. She pulled out the folded policy sheet again and shoved it at me. I unfolded it. The sheet was blank on the back and the front had a paragraph about appeal windows but nothing about verification. I folded the sheet and handed it back. I told Betty I would be filing a formal complaint with the board about the fake photo, the missing decal, and the unauthorized tow attempt. She said complaints take 6 weeks to process and I would still owe the fees. I said I was not paying anything until I saw proof the violation was real. She said the proof was in the photo. I said the photo showed the wrong address. She said I was misreading the metadata. I said I was a pool service tech who deals with HOA boards every day and I know what a fake timestamp looks like. She turned and walked toward the clubhouse. Over her shoulder she said I had 24 hours to replace my decal or the next tow would go through without a call. I went inside and checked my front door. No notice, no tape residue, no sign anyone had posted anything. I checked my mail. Nothing from the HOA. I logged into the resident portal and checked my account. No new violations, no notices, no appeals. I took screenshots of everything. Then I went back outside and checked my windshield. The decal outline was faint but visible. It looked like someone had peeled it off recently. I took a close-up photo. Then I walked around the neighborhood and checked other vehicles. Half the cars on my street had no decals. None of them had violation notices. The next morning, I got an email from the Prairie Crossing HOA board. The subject line said final notice regarding parking violations. I opened it. The email listed 3 separate fines. One for parking in a restricted zone 3 days ago. One for failing to maintain a valid decal. One for obstructing an authorized tow. The total was $900. The email said payment was due within 10 days or the HOA would file a lien against my property. I replied and asked for documentation of each violation. The reply came back in 5 minutes. Documentation requests must be submitted in writing to the board secretary and will be processed within 30 business days. I did not have 30 days. I had a notary appointment booked for next week to finalize my disclosure paperwork for the house sale, and missing that appointment would delay my sworn statements for weeks. If the HOA filed a lien, it would show up on the title search and kill the deal. I called my real estate attorney. She said liens take time to process and I could fight it, but the fastest path was to pay the fines under protest and then sue for a refund after the sale closed. I said that felt like letting Betty win. She said sometimes you have to lose a battle to win the war. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called the tow company. The dispatcher said they had no record of a service call to my address. I asked if Betty Wilson had an account with them. The dispatcher said she could not discuss client accounts. I asked if the company had a contract with Prairie Crossing HOA. She said yes. I asked if the contract allowed board members to authorize tows without management company approval. She put me on hold. When she came back, she said all tow authorizations must come from the property management company regional supervisor or the board president. I asked who the board president was. She said she could not give out that information. I thanked her and hung up. I looked up the Prairie Crossing HOA board roster online. The president was a man named Greg Halterman. The vice president was Betty Wilson. The secretary was someone I had never heard of. The treasurer was someone else I had never heard of. I sent an email to Greg Halterman asking for a meeting to discuss the fines. No reply. I sent a follow-up. No reply. I checked the board meeting schedule. The next meeting was in 3 weeks. Too late. I started building a case file. I printed every email, every portal screenshot, every photo. I made a timeline. 3 days ago, I was working a job in Redmond and I had GPS timestamps and client signatures to prove it. I was not parked on the street in Prairie Crossing. I was 30 minutes away. I pulled my work schedule and client invoices. I printed those too. Then I went back through my photos and found pictures of my truck in my driveway on the day Betty claimed I was parked illegally. The timestamps matched. I had proof I was somewhere else when the violation supposedly happened. I went back outside and walked the neighborhood again. This time I took photos of every car without a decal. I counted 16 vehicles. I knocked on doors and asked neighbors if they had received violation notices. Most said no. One woman said she got a notice last month, but it disappeared before she could appeal. Another man said his truck was towed 2 weeks ago and he paid $400 to get it back, but the HOA never provided documentation of the violation. I asked if he kept receipts. He said yes. I asked if he would be willing to share them. He said absolutely. That evening I got a knock on my door. I opened it and found a man in a polo shirt with a Prairie Crossing Management Company logo. He said he was the property manager and he wanted to talk about my violations. I invited him in. He declined. He said this would be quick. The HOA had requested a formal review of my account and they had found additional violations dating back 4 months. Overgrown grass, trash cans left out past 7 a.m., a holiday decoration that stayed up 2 days past the deadline. The total fines were now $2,300. I asked for documentation. He handed me a packet. The packet had printed photos of my house with dates stamped in the corner. None of the photos matched my memory. The grass in the pictures looked 2 inches longer than I ever let it grow. The trash cans in the picture were a different color than mine. The holiday decoration was a wreath I did not own. I asked where these photos came from. He said the HOA compliance team takes routine photos during neighborhood inspections. I asked to see the inspection logs. He said those are internal records. I asked when the inspections happened. He said he could not disclose that. I asked who took the photos. He said the compliance coordinator. I asked if that was Betty Wilson. He smiled and said he could not discuss personnel. I closed the door and added the packet to my file. Then I sent an email to the management company regional supervisor asking for a meeting. No reply. I called the main office. The receptionist said the regional supervisor was out of town and would not be back for 2 weeks. I asked if anyone else could help. She said no. I asked if I could escalate the issue. She said I could file a formal complaint through the resident portal. I said I already tried that. She said complaints take 6 weeks. I hung up. I spent the next 2 days calling everyone I could think of. The City Code Enforcement Office said the HOA was a private entity and they had no jurisdiction unless the HOA violated a city ordinance. I asked if fake violation notices qualified. The clerk said maybe, but I would need proof. I said I had proof. She said I could file a complaint and someone would investigate within 90 days. I said I did not have 90 days. She said that was the standard timeline. I asked if there was an expedited process. She said no. I thanked her and hung up. I called a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. He said he could take the case, but his retainer was $5,000 and the case could take 6 months. I said I needed a resolution in 2 weeks. He said that was not realistic. I thanked him and hung up. 3 days later, I was at a gas station filling my truck when Betty pulled into the next pump. She climbed out and walked over before I could finish fueling. She asked if I had paid my fines yet. I said no. She said the deadline was approaching and the lien filing would be automatic. I said I was disputing the violations. She said disputes are not allowed after the appeal window closes. I said the appeal window was based on a fake posting. She pulled out her phone and showed me the photo again. I pulled out my phone and showed her the metadata. She said metadata is not reliable. I said her photo was taken at the wrong address. She said I was reading it wrong. I asked her to explain how I was reading GPS coordinates wrong. She said I was being difficult and that would be noted in my file. I asked what file. She said every resident has a compliance file. I asked to see mine. She said files are confidential. I asked under what authority. She said HOA bylaws. I asked to see the bylaws. She said I should have received a copy when I moved in. I said I did not. She said that was my problem. I asked where I could get a copy. She said the board secretary keeps copies, but they are not available to residents without a formal request. I asked how to make a formal request. She said submit it in writing to the board secretary and wait 30 business days. I said that was circular. She said that was policy. I put the fuel nozzle back on the pump and capped my tank. I told Betty I had GPS proof I was in Redmond when she claimed I was parked illegally in Prairie Crossing. She said GPS logs are not admissible. I asked who decided that. She said the board. I asked when. She said it was part of the updated enforcement guidelines. I asked when those guidelines were updated. She said last month. I asked if residents were notified. She said the guidelines are posted in the clubhouse lobby. I said I never saw them. She said ignorance is not a defense. I said that was the second time she had used that line. She smiled. This is not parking, it is a violation, she said. I asked what that meant. She said it meant the board had the authority to define violations and residents had the obligation to comply. I said that sounded like a dictatorship. She said it was called governance. I said governance requires transparency. She said transparency is not required when the rules are clear. I said the rules were not clear because half of them were not published and the other half contradicted the county code. She said county code does not apply to private HOA enforcement. I said that was not true. She said it was true as long as the HOA rules were more restrictive than county code. I said her rules were not more restrictive, they were fake. She said that was defamation, and I should be careful. I said defamation requires a false statement, and I had proof my statement was true. She said proof does not matter if the board decides otherwise. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA drama. I kept my phone in my pocket because I was saving one clip for the finale. Betty turned and walked back to her car. She filled her tank and drove off. I stood there for a minute trying to figure out my next move. Then I remembered something the neighbor had said. His truck was towed 2 weeks ago and he paid $400 to get it back. I called him and asked which tow company took his truck. He said it was the same company that tried to tow mine. I asked if he kept the receipt. He said yes. I asked if I could see it. He said sure. I drove to his house and he handed me a printed receipt. The receipt listed a tow fee, a storage fee, and an administrative fee. The total was $412. The authorization signature at the bottom was the same looping scrawl I had seen on the form Betty showed the tow driver. I took a photo of the receipt and thanked him. I called the tow company again. This time I asked to speak to the owner. The dispatcher said the owner was not available. I asked when he would be available. She said she could not say. I asked if I could leave a message. She said yes. I left my number and a brief message saying I had questions about an unauthorized tow authorization. The owner called me back 20 minutes later. He said his company did not do unauthorized tows. I said I had a receipt showing a signature that did not match any management company records. He said he would look into it. I asked how long that would take. He said a few days. I said I needed answers faster because the HOA was threatening a lien. He said he understood, but he had to follow procedure. I thanked him and hung up. That night, I got another email from the HOA. The subject line said, "Lien filing notice." The email said the board had voted to proceed with a lien because I had not paid the fines or responded to the final notice. I replied immediately with screenshots of every message I had sent. I pointed out that I had responded multiple times and the board had ignored every response. The reply came back in 3 minutes. Your responses were not submitted through the proper channels and are not considered valid. I asked what the proper channels were. No reply. I called my real estate attorney again. She said the lien would show up on the title search within a week. I asked if I could stop it. She said I could file an injunction, but that would cost more than the fines and take longer than I had. I asked what she recommended. She said pay the fines under protest and sue later. I said I was not going to do that. She said then I needed to prepare for the lien to kill my sale. I thanked her and hung up. The next morning I drove to the county courthouse and asked about filing a restraining order against the HOA. The clerk said restraining orders are for harassment and threats, not financial disputes. I said the HOA was harassing me with fake violations. She said I would need proof. I showed her my file. She flipped through it and said it looked like a civil dispute. I asked what my options were. She said small claims court or a civil lawsuit. I asked how long small claims would take. She said 4 to 6 months. I said I did not have that long. She said then I should consider mediation. I asked if the HOA was required to participate in mediation. She said no. I thanked her and left. I spent the rest of the day calling every contact I had in the property management industry. One of them knew someone who worked for the company that managed Prairie Crossing. She said the regional supervisor was a man named Tom Brennan, and he had a reputation for letting board members run wild as long as the fees kept coming in. I asked if she had his direct number. She said no, but she knew someone who did. She texted me the number an hour later. I called Tom Brennan and left a message. He did not call back. 2 days later, I got another email from the HOA. The subject line said additional violations pending review. The email listed 4 new violations: parking in a fire lane, blocking a sidewalk, unauthorized vehicle modification, failure to maintain landscaping. The total was now $3,600. I did not bother replying. I added the email to my file and kept building my case. I went back to the tow company and asked to speak to the owner in person. The dispatcher said he was not available. I said I would wait. She said he might not come in today. I said I would wait anyway. She shrugged. I sat in the lobby for 2 hours. The owner finally came out. He said he had reviewed the authorization forms and they were all signed by the management company. I showed him the receipt from my neighbor and asked if the signature matched. He looked at it and said it looked similar. I asked if he verified the signatures before authorizing tows. He said his drivers verify authorizations with the dispatcher, and the dispatcher verifies with the client. I asked who the client was. He said Prairie Crossing HOA. I asked if the client was the board or the management company. He said the contract was with the management company, but the board had signing authority. I asked if that was normal. He said it was common in HOA contracts. I asked if he kept copies of the authorization forms. He said yes. I asked if I could see the form for my address. He said no. I asked why. He said it was proprietary. I thanked him and left. That evening, I got a call from a man who introduced himself as a gate vendor technician. He said he worked on the access control system for Prairie Crossing, and he had heard I was having issues with the board. I asked how he heard. He said word gets around. He said the board had been flagging vehicles for towing based on the gate logs, but the logs showed something interesting. He said the logs recorded every entry and exit with timestamps and vehicle descriptions. He said the log for the day Betty claimed I was parked illegally showed my truck entering at 6:40 a.m. and not leaving until 7:10 p.m. I asked if he could send me a copy of the log. He said he could not officially share logs, but he could show me the screen if I stopped by the gate control room. I asked when. He said tonight. I drove to the clubhouse and met him in the back room. He pulled up the log on his laptop and I took photos with my phone. The timestamps were clear. My truck was inside the community all day. It never parked on the street. I added the photos to my file. Then I went home and sent an email to Tom Brennan with the gate logs attached. I said the logs proved the violation was fake and the HOA was filing fraudulent fines. I said if the management company did not drop the fines and cancel the lien, I would file a complaint with the state attorney general and copy every news outlet in King County. I hit send and waited. Tom Brennan replied 2 hours later. He said he would review the matter and get back to me within 48 hours. I replied and said I needed an answer in 24 hours because my notary appointment was in 3 days. He said he would do his best. I said his best needed to be faster. No reply. The next morning, I got a call from a number I did not recognize. I answered, and a woman said she was an investigator with the Washington State Attorney General's office. She said someone had filed a complaint about Prairie Crossing HOA and she was following up. I asked who filed the complaint. She said she could not disclose that. I asked what the complaint was about. She said fraudulent fines and unauthorized lien filings. I said that sounded like my situation. She asked if I had documentation. I said yes. She asked if I could send it. I said absolutely. She gave me an email address and I sent the entire file. She said she would review it and contact me within a week. I said I needed a resolution faster. She said the office does not expedite investigations. I thanked her and hung up. That afternoon, Betty showed up at my door again. She knocked hard and I opened it. She said the board had scheduled a special hearing to discuss my violations and I was required to attend. I asked when. She said tomorrow night. I asked if I would have a chance to present my evidence. She said the hearing format did not allow for resident presentations. I asked what the point of the hearing was. She said the board needed to decide whether to proceed with the lien or escalate to a lawsuit. I asked on what grounds. She said failure to pay fines and obstruction of HOA enforcement. I said I had proof the fines were fake. She said the board would review the proof and make a decision. I asked if the board had already made a decision. She smiled. The hearing is a formality, she said. I asked what that meant. She said it meant the board had the authority to enforce compliance and my objections would be noted but not considered binding. I said that sounded like a kangaroo court. She said it was called due process. I told Betty I would not be attending the hearing. She said attendance was mandatory. I said the bylaws did not require attendance. She said the updated bylaws did. I asked when the bylaws were updated. She said last month. I asked if residents were notified. She said the updated bylaws were posted in the clubhouse lobby. I said I never saw them. She said ignorance is not a defense. I asked for a copy of the updated bylaws. She said I could request one from the board secretary and it would be provided within 30 business days. I said the hearing was tomorrow. She said that was not her problem. I closed the door and called Tom Brennan again. No answer. I left another message. Then I called my real estate attorney and told her about the hearing. She said HOA hearings are not legally binding unless the bylaws explicitly grant the board judicial authority, and even then the decision can be appealed in court. I asked if I should attend. She said it might be worth attending to put my evidence on the record. I said the board was not allowing resident presentations. She said then attending was pointless. I thanked her and hung up. The next evening I drove to the clubhouse anyway. The hearing was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the main conference room. I arrived at 6:50 and found the room locked. I knocked. No answer. I tried the handle. Locked. I walked around to the front office and found Betty sitting at a desk. She looked up and said the hearing was closed to non-board members. I said I was the subject of the hearing. She said that did not grant me access. I asked how I was supposed to defend myself if I was not allowed in the room. She said I could submit a written statement and the board would consider it. I asked where I should submit the statement. She said I could leave it with her. I asked if she would actually give it to the board. She said of course. I did not believe her. I went back to my truck and wrote a 3-page statement summarizing the fake violations, the fake photos, the gate logs, the unauthorized tow attempt, and the missing decal. I printed it on a portable printer I kept in my truck and walked back to the office. Betty was gone. I left the statement on her desk and walked back to the conference room. The door was still locked. I knocked again. A man opened the door a crack. I recognized him from the board roster. Greg Halterman, the president. He said the hearing was in progress and I could not enter. I said I was the subject. He said the board was reviewing the matter and would notify me of the decision. I asked when. He said within 5 business days. I asked if I could at least make a statement. He said no. I asked why. He said the hearing format did not allow it. I asked who decided the format. He said the board. I asked if that was legal. He said it was within the board's authority. I asked if he had read my written statement. He said he had not seen it. I asked where Betty was. He said she stepped out. I asked if she would be back. He said probably. I asked if he could confirm she would deliver my statement to the board. He said he could not make promises on her behalf. I asked if I could hand him the statement directly. He said no. I asked why. He said he was not the board secretary. I asked who the board secretary was. He said Betty. I started to respond, but he closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a minute trying to decide what to do. Then I heard voices inside the conference room. I pressed my ear to the door. Betty was talking. She said I had refused to cooperate and the fines were justified. Greg asked if there was any documentation. Betty said yes. She said she had photos and logs. Greg asked if the photos were verified. Betty said they were taken during routine compliance inspections. Another voice asked if I had been given a chance to appeal. Betty said yes. The appeal window closed 3 days after the notice was posted. The voice asked if there was proof the notice was posted. Betty said yes. She had a photo. The voice asked if the photo showed my address. Betty said it showed my door. The voice asked if anyone verified the address. Betty said verification was not required because the photo had a timestamp. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The voices continued. Greg asked if there were any other violations. Betty listed them. Parking in a fire lane, blocking a sidewalk, unauthorized vehicle modification, failure to maintain landscaping. The voice asked for documentation. Betty said the documentation was in the file. The voice asked to see the file. Betty said the file was confidential. The voice asked why. Betty said resident files are not shared outside the board. The voice asked if I had been given a copy of my file. Betty said no. The voice asked why. Betty said the bylaws do not require disclosure. The voice asked if that was legal. Betty said it was within the board's authority. Greg asked if there were any objections to proceeding with the lien. No one spoke. Greg said the motion was approved. The lien would be filed tomorrow. The meeting was adjourned. I stopped recording and walked back to my truck. The next morning I called Tom Brennan and told him the board had approved the lien. I said I had recorded the hearing and the board had not reviewed any of my evidence. He said recording a closed meeting was illegal. I said the hearing was supposed to be open because I was the subject. He said the board had discretion over hearing procedures. I said the board had violated my due process rights. He said due process does not apply to HOA hearings. I said I would be filing a lawsuit. He said that was my choice. I asked if he was going to do anything. He said he would review the matter. I said he had been saying that for a week. He said the review process takes time. I said I did not have time. He said that was not his problem. I hung up. I drove to the county recorder's office and asked if the lien had been filed yet. The clerk checked the system and said no. I asked how long I had before it showed up. She said liens are usually processed within 3 business days of filing. I asked if I could block the filing. She said no. I asked if I could challenge it after it was filed. She said yes, but I would need to go through the court system. I asked how long that would take. She said months. I thanked her and left. I called the tow company owner again. This time he answered. I told him I had proof the HOA was authorizing tows without proper verification. He said he was aware of the issue. I asked what he planned to do about it. He said he was reviewing the contract. I asked if he would stop taking authorizations from Betty. He said he could not do that without terminating the contract. I asked if he was planning to terminate the contract. He said he was considering it. I asked when he would decide. He said within the month. I said that was not fast enough. He said it was the best he could do. I thanked him and hung up. That afternoon, I got a call from the investigator with the Attorney General's office. She said she had reviewed my file and it raised concerns. She asked if I had filed a police report. I said no. She said I should. She said the fake photos and altered timestamps could constitute fraud. I asked if she could open an investigation. She said her office does not handle individual disputes, but a police report would create a record that could be useful later. I thanked her and drove to the police station. The officer at the desk took my statement and asked for documentation. I handed him my file. He flipped through it and said it looked like a civil matter. I said the HOA was committing fraud. He said fraud requires intent and proof of damages. I said the damages were $3,600 in fake fines and a lien that was going to kill my house sale. He said he would file a report and forward it to the detective division. I asked how long that would take. He said a few weeks. I said I did not have a few weeks. He said that was the process. I asked for a case number. He wrote it on a slip of paper and handed it to me. I left the station and drove home. I had one more card to play. I pulled out my phone and reviewed the recording I had made outside the conference room. The audio was clear enough to hear Betty lying about the documentation. I made a copy and saved it to 3 different cloud accounts. Then I sent a copy to Tom Brennan with a message. This recording proves the board approved the lien without reviewing my evidence. If you do not drop the fines and cancel the lien by tomorrow morning, I will send this recording to every news outlet in Washington and file a lawsuit against the management company for negligence. Tom Brennan called me 10 minutes later. He said the recording was illegal and inadmissible. I said it did not need to be admissible to be embarrassing. He said threatening the company with bad press was extortion. I said exposing fraud was journalism. He said he would talk to the board. I said he had until 9 a.m. tomorrow. He hung up. The next morning, I got an email from Tom Brennan. The subject line said resolution proposal. The email said the management company had reviewed my case and determined that the violations were based on incorrect information. The fines would be dropped and the lien would not be filed. In exchange, I would sign a release agreeing not to sue the management company or the board. I replied and said I would not sign a release. I said the board owed me a public apology and a refund of any fees I had paid. He replied and said the board does not issue public apologies. I said then we had nothing to discuss. He replied and said the offer was final. I did not respond. That afternoon, I got a knock on my door. I opened it and found a deputy sheriff standing on my porch. He handed me an envelope and said I was being summoned to a mediation session. I asked who requested the mediation. He said Prairie Crossing HOA. I asked when. He said next week. I asked if attendance was mandatory. He said no, but refusing to attend might be used against me in court. I thanked him and closed the door. I opened the envelope and read the summons. The mediation was scheduled at the sheriff's substation lobby with a deputy present. The notice said the purpose was to resolve the dispute without litigation. I called my real estate attorney and told her about the summons. She said mediation was voluntary and I did not have to attend, but it might be a chance to present my evidence in front of a neutral party. I asked if the board would be there. She said probably. I asked if Betty would be there. She said almost certainly. I said I would go. The mediation was scheduled for Wednesday at 2 p.m. I spent the next 3 days organizing my file and preparing a presentation. I printed color copies of the gate logs, the fake photos, the receipts, the timeline, and the recording transcript. I made 3 sets. One for me, one for the mediator, and one for the board. Wednesday arrived. I drove to the sheriff's substation and walked into the lobby at 1:50. The mediator was already there. He introduced himself as a retired judge who volunteered for community mediation. He said the session would be informal and confidential. I said I understood. He asked if I had brought documentation. I said yes. He said the board representatives would arrive shortly. Betty and Greg walked in at 2:05. Betty was carrying a briefcase and a coffee tumbler. Greg had a folder. They sat on the opposite side of the table. The mediator asked everyone to introduce themselves. I went first. I said my name and my address, and I explained that I was disputing fraudulent fines and a threatened lien. Betty went next. She said she was the fines and enforcement coordinator for Prairie Crossing HOA, and the fines were legitimate. Greg went last. He said he was the board president, and he was here to resolve the dispute. The mediator asked me to present my case. I handed him a copy of my file and walked him through the timeline. I started with the fake violation notice and the metadata showing the wrong address. I showed him the gate logs proving I was not parked on the street. I showed him the receipt from my neighbor with the forged signature. I showed him the email chain where the management company ignored my requests for documentation. I played a clip from the recorded hearing where Betty admitted the files were confidential and residents were not allowed to see them. The mediator listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked Betty to respond. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. She said the violations were documented according to HOA procedures. She handed the mediator a packet of photos. The mediator flipped through them. He asked if the photos had been verified. Betty said they were taken during compliance inspections. The mediator asked who conducted the inspections. Betty said she did. The mediator asked if there were any witnesses. Betty said witnesses were not required. The mediator asked if residents were notified of inspections. Betty said no. The mediator asked why. Betty said the bylaws do not require notification. The mediator set the photos aside and asked to see the bylaws. Betty said she did not bring a copy. The mediator asked why. Betty said the bylaws are available in the clubhouse lobby. The mediator asked if I had access to the bylaws. I said no. Betty said that was my fault for not requesting them. The mediator asked how residents are supposed to request bylaws if the process takes 30 business days and the appeal window is only 72 hours. Betty said the timelines are separate. The mediator asked if that created a due process issue. Betty said no. The mediator did not look convinced. Greg spoke up. He said the board was willing to negotiate. He said the fines could be reduced if I agreed to sign a release. I said I was not interested in a release. I said the fines were fake and the board owed me an apology. Greg said the board does not apologize. I said then we were done. The mediator asked if there was any middle ground. I said yes. Drop the fines, cancel the lien, and agree to a management audit that exposes the pattern. Betty stood up. She said the board would not agree to an audit. The mediator asked why. Betty said audits are internal matters. The mediator asked if the board had something to hide. Betty did not answer. The mediator asked to see the recording I had mentioned. I played the full clip. The mediator listened. When it finished, he asked Betty if she had reviewed my evidence before the hearing. Betty said she had reviewed the file. The mediator asked if the file included the gate logs. Betty said no. The mediator asked why. Betty said the gate logs were not submitted through the proper channels. The mediator asked what the proper channels were. Betty said written requests to the board secretary. The mediator asked if I had submitted a written request. I said yes. Betty said she never received it. I pulled out my phone and showed the mediator the email. The timestamp was 3 days before the hearing. Betty said emails are not considered written requests. The mediator asked what format was required. Betty did not answer. The mediator asked Greg if the board was willing to reconsider. Greg said the board had already voted. The mediator asked if the vote was based on accurate information. Greg said the board relied on the documentation provided by the enforcement coordinator. The mediator asked if anyone on the board had verified the documentation. Greg said that was not his responsibility. The mediator asked whose responsibility it was. Greg pointed at Betty. Betty said she was not required to verify anything because the bylaws grant the enforcement coordinator full discretion. The mediator closed his notepad. He said he could not force a resolution, but he could make a recommendation. He said the evidence suggested the violations were not properly documented and the hearing did not meet basic due process standards. He said the board should drop the fines and cancel the lien. He said if the board refused, I would likely win in court. Betty said the board would not drop the fines. The mediator asked why. Betty said because I had obstructed enforcement. The mediator asked how. Betty said I interfered with the tow. The mediator asked if interfering meant making a phone call. Betty said yes. The mediator said that was not obstruction. Betty stood up and said the mediation was a waste of time. She turned to leave. The mediator said the session was not over. Betty said she was done. She walked toward the door. Greg followed. The mediator asked if they were refusing to negotiate. Betty said the board had made its decision. The mediator said the decision was based on false information. Betty said that was my opinion. The mediator said it was his opinion too. Betty opened the door and walked out. Greg hesitated. He looked at me, then at the mediator, then at Betty. He followed her out. The mediator turned to me and said he would file a report with the county. He said the report would note that the board refused to negotiate and the evidence supported my claims. He said the report might be useful if I decided to sue. I thanked him and left. The next day I got a call from Tom Brennan. He said the board had agreed to drop 2 of the fines but not all of them. I asked which ones. He said the parking violation and the decal violation. I asked about the obstruction fine and the other bogus violations. He said those would stand. I asked why. He said the board had discretion. I said the board had no evidence. He said the board disagreed. I said I would see him in court. He hung up. I spent the weekend preparing a lawsuit. My attorney said small claims court was the fastest option. I filed the paperwork on Monday. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. I sent a copy of the filing to Tom Brennan and copied the board. No reply. 2 weeks later, I got an email from the management company. The subject line said policy update. The email said the board had adopted an emergency policy requiring 2 signatures and documented proof before any tow could be ordered. The email said the policy was effective immediately. I replied and asked if the policy applied retroactively. No reply. 3 weeks later, I got another email from Tom Brennan. The subject line said settlement offer. The email said the board was willing to drop all fines and cancel the lien if I agreed to withdraw the lawsuit. I replied and said I would withdraw the lawsuit if the board issued a public apology and agreed to the management audit. He replied and said the board would not apologize, but they would agree to an audit. I said that was acceptable. He sent me a settlement agreement. I signed it. The lawsuit was dismissed. The audit happened a month later. The auditor was a third-party consultant hired by the management company. She reviewed 5 years of enforcement records. She found that Betty had issued over 200 violation notices in the past year, and more than half were based on photos that could not be verified. She found that Betty had authorized 11 tows without proper documentation. She found that Betty had collected over $50,000 in fines, and 20% of that total was later refunded after residents complained. The auditor recommended that Betty be removed from the enforcement coordinator role and that the board adopt a transparency policy requiring all violation notices to include photographic evidence with verified timestamps. The board held a special meeting to discuss the audit. I attended. So did 15 other residents who had been fined. The meeting was tense. Greg opened by saying the board took the audit seriously and changes would be made. He said Betty had resigned from the enforcement coordinator role effective immediately. Betty stood up. She said she had not resigned. Greg said the board had accepted her resignation. Betty said she never submitted a resignation. Greg said the board had voted to remove her. Betty said the vote was invalid. Greg said the vote was recorded in the minutes. Betty demanded to see the minutes. Greg said the minutes would be available in 30 business days. Betty shouted that the board was corrupt. Greg said the meeting was adjourned. Betty refused to leave. A deputy escorted her out. The board adopted the new policy the following week. 2 signatures and documented proof before any tow. Violation notices must include verified photos with visible timestamps and addresses. Residents have 10 business days to appeal. The appeal process must include a hearing where residents can present evidence. The changes were posted in the clubhouse lobby and emailed to every resident. I closed on my house 3 weeks later. The title search was clean. No liens, no encumbrances. I moved out the day after closing. I never saw Betty again. I heard from a neighbor that she tried to run for the board again the next year but lost. The new board president was the neighbor whose truck had been towed. He ran on a platform of transparency and accountability. He won by a landslide. The tow company terminated its contract with Prairie Crossing 6 months later. The owner said the liability was too high. The board signed a new contract with a different company that required management company approval for every tow. I kept my file. I still have it. Every email, every photo, every receipt, every recording. I never had to use it again, but I kept it just in case. Because in an HOA, you never know when someone like Betty will show up with a clipboard and a smile, ready to tell you that ignorance is not a defense and the rules are whatever she says they are. And when that happens, you better have proof. Because proof is the only thing that matters, not the rules. Not the bylaws, not the board, just proof, and I had it. Until the next story, take care, and I will see you next time.